Welcome back, everyone, to Random's Thoughts. We're coming to you today with another Diamond deck breakdown in Runestrike. Today, we're going to be talking about Majus, or Majus. I'm still torn on how to pronounce this guy's name. But anyway, it's one of the initial starter heroes that you begin the game with. And this specific aggressive build is actually very light in the essence department. And it's something that if you are just starting out your Runestrike journey, you can definitely jump into very quickly with either an even more budget version, but still rack up some wins and then add to it as time goes on in order to try and climb the ranks. So let's jump into it. Now, we've talked about this list a little bit before in some of the arena runs, and you'll notice up at the top here that it actually still says Midge Soldiers. That is because, shout out to viewer Midgeworth, had provided the initial core for this build and suggested that we give it a whirl. I know that he has been on the soldier strategy for a while, and I was very much interested in trying to explore other aggressive options. Other aggressive options, well, we do need to take a moment before we even jump into the Majus build, the abilities, anything like that, to talk a little bit about, I guess, the state of aggro as a whole and where this particular build and other ones fit in. Realistically, you have Ogma as the top dog. It's pretty hard to argue with that at this point in time. Maybe that'll shift over time as more cards get introduced or as the meta happens to evolve. But realistically, right now, if you want the best aggro deck, you're really looking at the Nature Chaos hero rather than here. However, there are a number of reasons that you might want to look at Majus over Ogma, not the least of which is, again, the low essence count. You do see a cheeky legendary down there in the corner, but it's absolutely not necessary, and we started with a somewhat different build that we'll talk about as we jump into it. So let's talk about Majus himself. What are the abilities and why are you bothering to play this particular champion in an aggressive strategy? Well, first and foremost is Scroll of Insight. It's his A1 ability, 2 blood, draw a rune, and it costs 1 less. This may seem weird because if you've come from other card games or just if you take a moment to think about it, most late game control decks want to ensure that they're drawing cards. Why? They want to get to their specific answers, whether it's their sweepers, their single target removal, and then ultimately their finishers, so that they can try and smooth out their draws, make sure that they're hitting the right things on the right times or at the right times, and then able to close the game out. Here's one of the worst kept secrets in card games. Aggro decks love card draw also. The problem is that often you're just not quite able to squeeze it in. Enter blood abilities. Yes, Ogma, as mentioned earlier, is probably if it's not probably, it is the premier aggro deck because of the aggressive-minded blood abilities, as well as a number of other factors. But the blood abilities play a big part. Majus doesn't quite have the aggressive options that Ogma does, but he does have sustainability. And one of the drawbacks of aggro is that when you first start the game, you have probably the most cards you're ever going to have in most games. Granted, we have a smaller starting hand size in Runestrike than other games, but you have this flood of resources initially, and then you dump your hand out, your opponent clears the board, and then you go, oh, well, I'm drawing 1 card a turn that could be a 1-drop on turn 7. Not super exciting. Majus alleviates that problem via Scroll of Insight and allows you to continually find gas. You got to keep the engine running somehow, and Majus has that option in spades. Additionally, because of the cost reduction, it also gives you the option to be a little higher velocity. What does that mean? Well, it means that you can flood the board more regularly. So it's not uncommon to end up filling up your board, and we'll talk about that later, and then your opponent sweeps it. Common thing in Runestrike. All right, well, now your hand, even though it would have been lower cost options to begin with, you're an aggro deck, you could have ended up with something clunky like Field Sergeants and Sickle Stalkers and Charioteers, but maybe they got hit with Scroll of Insight, and now due to the cost reduction, you can just go, oh, you wiped my board? Here's a whole new board. I don't need Rise of the Undead or other singular cards such as Trample Herd to fill up the board. I could do it the more traditional way and just drop soldiers into every lane, or specific lanes. That'll also come into play. Now, his second ability is Arcane Infusion, which is gain 2 mana. I'll be honest, in this particular build, you are basically just spamming A1 on cooldown. there's really no reason to even look at the other ones for the most part. There will be scenarios where maybe it plays in, you happen to have a full board, your hand has built up, you don't need to Scroll of Insight, you're going to build up again after either between the cost reductions or Arcane Infusion, and then you have this rush of mana in a singular turn to plop your hand onto the board. It could happen. Now the last one is Arcane Construction, the usual theme, don't have it unlocked. It could definitely play into it. You're creating a body with your blood, but realistically, as I said, you're spamming A1. You're not often going to have a lot of blood retained just over the course of the game, so it doesn't play into too much. Other Magus builds may do that, but not really here. With the champion out of the way, let's talk about the actual cards. As you can see, the curve for this particular deck is very low. There is somewhat of a glut at 4 mana, but we top out at 5, which even in contrast to Ogma is very low. Ogma does have some other high-end cards, but we're just coming in much faster than that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were changes to this deck. Originally, I had a much more heavy soldier theme. What soldiers are we talking about? Well, namely, we were originally featuring the 4-cost Captain of the Guard, as well as extra copies of Naval Explorer. Over time, the soldier count has somewhat shrunk, because some of them are realistically just very clunky, and truly, I think you could go even further. There is very much a reason to continue with the soldier synergy, and you'll see as we talk about the various cards why that is. But there is an upper limit to it. While you can be a tribal deck, and this kind of goes across the board, it isn't strictly for just this thing that we're talking about. It's any sort of tribal build that you want to play. At some point, there are diminishing returns for continuing to stick within the theme. You're sacrificing power level for quote-unquote synergy. But sometimes the synergistic cards just don't offer enough. They're just situational enough. They're just not quite powerful enough compared to their counterparts that are out of tribe. You have to be very careful with that, and I know personally I fall into that trap a lot because I love playing tribal themes. But I also love winning, and there's sometimes some tension between those two objectives. So, we're actually going to start off without one of the tribal cards. It's a somewhat oft-maligned myth card, and that's Mana Burn. I would love to include other burn cards in this deck, and I think that's where it's going to need to move, but that's for a later segment. Mana Burn serves multiple purposes. It can be removal, and it can be face damage. We're always looking for flexibility, and we've talked about it with the Blitz cards, and you'll see the Blitz package again later. But Mana Burn allows you to close out games that you otherwise would not be able to. Often I'm holding this card till the end of the game unless you absolutely, positively cannot allow something to exist on the board. Or you're going to kill them through onboard damage. But usually you're holding this for the turn 10, aim it at their face and go, kablammo! I'm just going to annihilate you, especially if you can have back-to-back turns of Mana Burn, because realistically, 20 damage out of hand, I don't know where the 12 came from, is just a lot. And you're going to be able to close out many games against many people that way. So it's something that, while it is not a common or basic card, as you can see many of the cards in this deck are, it is very important. And it's going to serve you in other myth decks as well. So I'd recommend crafting this if you have the opportunity. Next up is Peasant Recruit. Now this is a basic card and is somewhat of an anomaly within the realm of Runestrike. Overall, there just aren't that many 1-drops. And even aside from that, there just ain't that many 1-drops that are worth talking about, especially within the context of aggro. Peasant Recruit kind of breaks that mold. I'm never truly excited about this thing. It often will die incidentally. It's not uncommon to have this thing croak due to a random Mastodon, of course, Sickle Stalkers, a variety of other things, and it's also important to keep in mind that if you end up drifting away from the soldier theme, this clearly loses power. But there are certainly games where it will snowball. You can go Peasant Recruit into Hired Steel, into Cavalry, into Charioteer, and just curve out, and you have a sizable 1-drop that is continuing to put pressure on your opponent. In addition, it can often come down after a sweeper alongside other things. So you just got to make sure that you're sequencing it so that you have the recruit played first. Believe me, I've made that mistake a bunch of times because I'm just playing too quickly. I would love if the Peasant Recruit could be something a little bit better, but for one drop, it's hard to complain all that much. It's ultimately okay. So aside from that, we're going to move to Hired Steel. Now, Hired Steel is something that I think a lot of people would initially cast aside, but honestly, it's probably my favorite card in the deck. Now, that's, of course, putting aside certain factors like, you know, Iron Bull. I mean, I have to exclude those when we're making these sort of assertions because realistically, you know. And there are other favorites that I'll harp on later on. But Hired Steel of the soldiers is probably my favorite soldier, which seems a little weird. It's just a 3/4 for 2. And losing the blood is obviously a drawback. It makes some of your turns a little awkward. However, there are a few different things to discuss here. First, as mentioned, you're spamming your A1 pretty much on cooldown. So, by turn 2, guess what? You're going to have 0 blood because you would have used A1. So now it's just a 3/4 for 2, which is a solid body. And it's unlikely to die to most early game removal. Your opponent has to wait until the Sickle Stalkers of the world. They could burn a combust on it. They're probably not super excited about doing that. You can't Mastodon it cleanly without help. A lot of these things will remove it if you have 2 of them, or spread it out across a couple turns. Otherwise, the Hired Steel can come down, and as with the Peasant Recruit, could come down later on the same turn as a buffing minion, or another buff effect, in order to make sure that this thing is even more sizable. Above all of that, I love it because of the curve play, and that's something that I feel is lacking right now in Runestrike. A lot of it is very jerky, very clunky, just I'm playing a thing and then I'm doing another thing, but it's not real smooth. I like how you could go Recruit into Hired Steel into Cavalry and have that smooth aggro curve going from the low end to the higher end. Now, the curve, as you can see right over there, is still escalating as opposed to having a high amount of low drops and then dropping off. It's a function of the way that this particular game works. But I really like Hired Steel a lot, and I think if you try it out, if you don't like it now, give it a try. I think you'll come around to it. Now, let's talk about one of my other favorite cards in the deck, because here's our good boy Molliser. Molliser is your Mastodon. Now, we are actually featuring Mastodon as well, but in the early iterations of the deck, this was the Mastodon. And I was trying really hard to avoid including the Blitz package, but we'll talk about it in more detail when we get there. Molliser allows you to do what aggressive decks need. Have a cheap drop. Its stats are, acceptable for where it is on the curve. It also synergizes well with the soldier theme. Obviously, this is one of those cards that you need to make sure you have a significant number of soldiers in order to ensure that you're always activating the Blitz. However, if you need to play this on 2, you don't hate yourself for it. It's fine. Clearly, you'd prefer if it had Blitz. Clearly, you'd prefer to play the higher statted, Hired Steel. Oof. That was a weird sentence. I feel like there's one of those in every one of these videos where I just struggle to get it out. But Molliser allows you to do all those things as well as running the puppies. Everybody loves dogs, right? So Molliser is definitely something that gives you a reason. Well, why am I playing soldiers? Molliser. It sounds a little weird that it's a random 2/3, but it's a 2/3 with Blitz for 2. It's justifiable to me to be in this faction because Blitz is so powerful that it is worth playing a deck just to feature something like this. And that's the main reason that I want to run the good boy here. So the next up is Naval Explorer, and I could see an argument to include more or cut this from the deck entirely. It's not a great body for aggro. It's not your ideal turn 2 play, and often when I'm playing the deck, I hold this in favor of other things and play this later in the game as a card draw. It's Conjure. You could obviously play it on 2 if you absolutely have to, and if you have no other 2 drops, yes, you have to play it on 2. It could then help smooth out your curve, where if you don't find a 3, you could go find a 3-drop, including extra copies of Cavalry, which I've done a number of times, and you're generally not unhappy to see that. It's also a soldier, so it buffs your Peasant Recruit. It can be buffed by other soldier effects later in the game. it plays into all the effects, but really it's the Warcry Conjure while being on theme. The reason why you might want to run more is, well, you want more of those effects. The reason you might want to cut it is because realistically the stat line is awful. You could find more aggressive options, and this may be a location, if you're comfortable with lowering the amount of soldiers in the build, that, yeah, there's probably a better 2-drop to run in this combination. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. We'll have to see. But Naval Explorer is definitely an acceptable option. It is an epic, so if you don't have it, this is one you can look at cutting. Next up is Cavalry, a common, and probably the cornerstone of this deck. It's one of the reasons that you are in Soldiers, which I think that speaks volumes about the deck on a number of fronts. Cavalry is not the most exciting card in the world. It is very easily removed, especially once buffed. However, it is a significant threat. Even singular buffs on it make it into a respectable option. At 2 attack, it's essentially 4 attack, but of course you get all the benefits of speed, and maybe you can do certain things, whether it's dealing with their resurrect minions, aka things like zombies that are small, or it's triggering multiple hit effects or punching through certain things. Of course, there are going to be drawbacks like counter, the ebb and flow, the wax and wane of the power of the keyword speed. But because we're featuring a number of stacking buffs, whether it's infused, it's charioteers, it's field sergeants, it's other things that are not included but could be in this build, cavalry is the reason to kind of be in Soldiers so that you can stack those things. Ultimately, it's still not that exciting, and that's part of the reason why this deck falls short and is probably at best a tier 2 build overall. You're not realistically going to be competing with the big boys on a consistent basis, but you can have some really wombo-y funny turns with things like Cavalry. Now, next up is the aforementioned Inspired to Arms, a rare, so again, not really breaking the bank in the essence department. All friendly minions gain 2 attack. It's a permanent attack buff. Well, as permanent as it gets when they get removed or debuffed or whatever. But it allows you to buff up the previously mentioned minion in Cavalry. You are often filling your board, so you can set up turns where even if you expect a sweeper, if you're able to Inspire on turn 5, crush them for a bunch of damage, they must Desert Twister, or they must Arcane Overload, or they must do whatever. If they don't, you end the game. And that's the power of this deck, is you can come out of the gates very aggressively. A lot of builds are very greedy in Runestrike right now. A lot of them are not featuring early game threats, early game removal. So you're able to take advantage of this particular meta development and slide in with Soldiers that, while it may not be the tippy top tier 0, tier S, tier whatever, however you choose to describe it, build, it does allow you to beat up the big dogs simply because you can come in faster than they can get going. Sometimes that's how it works, and you can take advantage of a given meta that way. So Inspired Arms definitely plays into that element. Next up is the beginning of the Blitz package. As mentioned earlier, I tried really to avoid this, but as we got into the higher ranks, it became evident that we didn't have an option here. We kind of needed it. There were 2 failings. One, while you can flood the board after a board clear, it's with minions that can't attack immediately. There just aren't that many that feature Blitz. Yes, you had Molliser, but that was literally it. And often you were filling the board with 2 attack things, 1 attack things. That's not very threatening. So even though you wipe the board, your opponent could, or you refill the board after a wipe, your opponent could just take a turn off and go, okay, well, I'll eat the damage because you have 1 card in hand and it's probably another soldier. So I'll then develop my board and then clear yours again afterwards. Or just single target removal / combat removal things. It got kind of weird. So we needed the Blitz package bolt to function as our removal, because notably there aren't many ways to interact with your opponent's board outside of just, I play a guy, hope that you misplay by playing something that I can eat, that sort of thing. It gets very uncomfortable very fast. So the Blitz was important for that. It's also important for face damage. All the usual reasons, but it's even more evident in this particular build because we're playing much more fair than most other decks, including the other aggro decks. So next up is Charioteer, which is one of the buffs that I really like keeping. The +2 defense is very relevant because the early game board clears, Desert Twister, Arcane Overload, and even a lot of removal and combat math is naturally centered on damage, as opposed to I'm going to Apocalypse, or I'm going to Set, or I'm going to whatever, that just wipes the board clean. Even later game removals, such as Meteor Storm, is going to rely on specific damage thresholds, and you can push some of your minions beyond them in order to survive them. Granted, Meteor Storm is a pretty significant amount of damage. Even on a hired steel or a cavalry, you're going to need to have multiple effects on it. Your opponent could clearly have whittled them down. A lot of caveats to that statement, but ultimately you do have the option to try and set up that sort of board. Otherwise, it's just making sure that, oh, your opponent thought they were going to be able to win this combat. I don't think so. Unfortunately, it is on the back end, which doesn't quite help aggro decks as much as you'd like. You'd probably prefer it to be more front-loaded on the attack, but again, if you have it on a speed minion, okay, well, it's essentially +2 attack on a cavalry. Still worthwhile, and the body itself isn't atrocious. A 4/3 is respectable. Next up is Dimensional Rift. This is the other card that probably fits in as my favorite card for the deck. Dimensional Rift is spectacular in aggressive decks. Why? It's a huge tempo gain. Oh, your opponent played some 7-drop. It's going to lock down the board. Let's say a Nemean Lion. Oh no, I can't get through that. Well, joke's on you, friend. We're going to Dimensional Rift it. It's going to take up your entire turn next turn. Oh, and I'm just pushing damage in the meantime. It is kind of a back-breaking play. And like I said, some of these Greedlord decks may be relying on a singular minion to do exactly that and lock down the board. Or, late in the game, all right, I'm running out of gas. I just can't quite get there. This deck does not feature a lot of burn. Again, something we'll come back to. It doesn't have a whole lot of reach. It just wants to punch you and play stuff, and it's playing relatively fair. Here's a way that you can be more unfair by gaining an enormous amount of tempo by bouncing their minion. I can't understate how powerful this card can be in this deck. And I'm looking forward to, as we get more cards, the value of this deck increasing and the value of Dimensional Rift in aggressive builds increasing. It's something to keep your eye on, whether it's in this deck or others. Next up is one of the more mediocre soldiers in this, and it used to be higher valued in this deck, but the value has dropped over time as we've removed the weaker soldiers, so therefore something had to be the weakest soldier. And that's Field Sergeant. It's a decent-sized body, the buff is fine, but it requires an existing board. You want to hit at least 2 things, or you're probably not excited about it. You can certainly set up scenarios where your opponent's minions that would have survived now no longer do. You can, of course, be pushing damage. Buffing cavalry is great. It curves from cavalry. All these things are fantastic, but ultimately it's a 3/5 for 4. Not super exciting. There are definitely other options that you consider including, but I think once you start removing, again, the quantity of soldiers and the quantity of buffs, a lot of the pieces rely on each other to ensure that they are actually respectable enough. And I think that as you remove, whether it's Field Sergeant or other parts, you really have to reevaluate the whole build and consider, is this thing worth it in the soldier form, or at all for that matter? So while I would love to replace Field Sergeant, you do have to be careful about it. Now, again, another rare as compared to the epic we were just looking at in Dimensional Rift, so not really breaking the bank, and you can definitely score some wins in the lower ranks, on your climb, or even, as you can see, getting to Diamond and playing in Diamond with some of these weaker cards. Next up is the other part, the middle part of the Blitz package. All the same story as Mastodon, but this is, well, just better. Sickle Stalker is, I think, the better of the Blitz options there, ignoring the legendaries, so I don't think anybody needs a story told there. Next up is Iron Bowl. Again, not necessary for this deck, but once I crafted it for a different deck, clearly it made its way in here. Blitz package, Frenzy, blah, 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 you know the story. So that's the breakdown of the individual cards. Let's talk a little bit about things that could make the cut or didn't make the cut, other options that you have for soldier builds. This deck doesn't feature a lot of out-of-combat removal, and that's why Treason gets a highlight here, because you can clear out not potentially multiple blockers, but also just simply, sometimes you have to remove something right now, and you can't quite manage it with combat. If your opponent clears the board and then follows it up with something that helps stabilize, say a Siren, a Mummy, or whatever, you could be in a tough spot because a lot of your minions are small. They don't most of them don't feature blitz. You may not be able to get it out of the way. Treason might allow you to do exactly that. Speaking of card draw, you could of course feature Royal Alchemist. Another low drop helps smooth the curve, but it does require probably removing some of the soldiers, and it makes it awkward in that you can't really play it and then follow up with things because you're going to be expending all your mana. Early in the game, it might be okay. Late in the game, obviously, you could refuel, but you're taking the turn off. So I'm not super excited about this one, but it is an option. Aside from soldiers, there are, of course, a number of spells that could be included. Restore Order happens to be one of them. While Majus, whatever, going back to the beginning, can provide fuel for the deck over the course of the game, Restore Order can give you that immediate boost, and sometimes that's necessary. You have to be careful because there are a number of, well, myth cards as well as neutral cards. I ended up cutting this because I had too many times where it was coming up empty. Last high-end thing, at least for now, and that's Commander, another card I don't have. I only throw this out here because it is a soldier, and it does function as an anti-board clear. The problem is that this comes so late in the game that I'm not sure that it's going to be worth it. However, it does simply fill the board. So if it turns out that you can spare a slot or two and then just sit on this thing and wait until the end of the game, maybe it's an option. I haven't quite gotten there yet. I haven't quite had the scenarios where that would be feasible, at least not commonly, but maybe this is going to be an option. Back to cards that I actually do have in War Chariot, another higher end thing, and there's going to be a bunch of these where you have to make this decision about how high end do you want to get. War Chariot provides some resilience to board clears, and given that some of them are going to be damage based, it's entirely possible that the minions on either side survive and then get buffed with the charioteer that pops out afterwards. Realistically, it's unlikely, given this has 6 health, why is it going to die? But it does have speed, so maybe your opponent has to target it down. Therefore, it's also going to benefit from the buffs that you have for the other cards. It'll be a little bit difficult to maybe set up a turn where you're holding Field Sergeant back or Inspire back before you're going to War Chariot, but maybe that will happen. It's something that I've had my eye on, but I haven't quite been able to squeeze into the deck yet. Another card that I don't happen to have, this time we need Hyperion to level it up, is War Elephant. We're really just talking about all the ones that have various soldier synergy. Realistically, I would expect this thing would probably come down after a sweeper alongside that peasant recruit that you drew on turn 6, that sort of thing. In which case, it ends up being a 6/6 Trampler for 5. That seems respectable. It's also a soldier on its own. So there is an option here to have this is the top end of your curve, but we're already flush with options that don't have blitz, don't really do a lot outside of punching. It's kind of tough to justify this as well as the previous card that we were talking about, but it does have trample, which allows you to push damage that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. So it's something that, again, you might want to consider in this particular build. We're jumping now into some cards that I don't actually have, such as Lionheart Knight. As you can see, I don't have Faith to level 8 to unlock it. It is an option. It's on the higher end. It fits in the Field Sergeant goal. I think this one might be worthwhile simply because it does provide an immediate impact as well as potentially granting more with Strike. It also, the guard is interesting simply because you could play this in an off lane and then just allow your minions to try and push. You just go for the swing for the fences, try and do the foot race option. I don't know if that's really worth it. It's something to consider. Next up is Legionnaire, which actually was suggested by chat, and I don't hate this idea. It's a respectable body somewhat. It's a little bit smaller inherently than, say, Field Sergeant, but this minion has Warcry trained, so you can get a number of different buffs, essentially a conjure for buffs for this thing. Some of them will end up being useless in some scenarios. Some of them will end up being blowouts in some scenarios. I'm not sure if it's necessarily worth skipping Field Sergeant for this thing, but it is something worth considering. So talking about cards that ended up on the cutting room floor, we'll start with Captain of the Guard. This was in the original build, but made its way out. Realistically, your curve is low enough. You could force it to be lower if you really wanted to. You don't need the Warcry for the reduction unless you're playing into a more mid-rangey, more controlling soldier plan. Plus, the body is kind of atrocious. Arcane Overload also fits in this slot where It was in some iterations. I know people are pushing me to try and re-include it, but the curve for this deck is so low that often Arcane Overload is a weaker Sever the Source. Somewhat. Yes, it deals it across the board. The damage to you is mostly irrelevant. You're an aggro deck. But unless you're hitting another Arcane Overload, you may not actually get through anything. It may not accomplish anything. So it's a very expensive card for something that you could probably get 80-90% of the effect more consistently out of something else. Leaving Order and moving into Myth, we actually have something that I thought was axiomatic for any Myth build, and that's Sever the Source. It isn't in this particular one, but I think it needs to somehow find a home in here. 3 damage is going to clear out a lot of blockers or allow you to finish off certain things in combat, but notably it can also be aimed at the face, which is something that is lacking in this deck and why the Blitz minions had to come in. You just don't quite have the reach that other aggressive decks do. It makes it a little weird because the cost is somewhat clunky despite the cost reduction on something else in your hand. It also can sometimes just not quite be good enough, hence Mana Burn getting the nod over Sever the Source. Late in the game, of course, Mana Burn is churning out a lot more damage than Sever the Source, regardless of whether you play other things in the same turn, for the most part. But it's something that we need to definitely keep our eyes on as to whether we can squeeze this in. Speaking of topping out the curve, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Horus. It solves a number of the problems in having Blitz, it has speed, it does a lot of things, whether it's removing stuff or simply punching face. I feel as though it might be too expensive for the deck, but if this slowly morphs into just a general Myth Order aggressive build instead of being soldiers, Horus should definitely get a look. Maybe it deserves it in just the soldier build as well. As far as closers go, Charge could be your option. While we do feature some minions that innately have speed, giving them the other ones that do not have its speed until end of turn could be very beneficial just to push an enormous amount of damage. We've seen certain things like this, such as Desperate Charge. Technically, Longship Raid kind of functions like this in other aggressive decks. And it could allow you to close games that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to, or clear out blockers to allow you to continue closing out the game. So it's something that you have to at least consider. It also is yet another in a long line of cards that help top out the curve. Another card that was in earlier iterations of the build and might make its way back in is Zephyr Knight. It allows you to present a threat, even though it's not a soldier, as well as clear out your opponent's stuff. Whether those are blockers, it's other threats, making your combat better, whatever it happens to be. Even if you just have to drop it on the board, that was a weird statement, on the board, you can buff this up afterwards, and due to the speed, you're getting 2 times the buffs. So it's a respectable threat in and of itself. One of the things that I've mentioned repeatedly throughout this is that the deck often does fill out the entire board, and Phalanx Formation kind of helps out a lot with that. It's not currently in my list, and I really think it should be. It's something that I was able to actually conjure off Naval Commander, and it put in a lot of work because, again, you could build out that board, but it's going to get wiped away by Desert Twister, or whatever the removal of choice happens to be. Phalanx can ensure that those pretty sturdy early game minions continue to be sturdy into the mid game and possibly into the late game, and dodge a lot of removal, force a lot of awkward combat, and allows you to extend and capitalize on your tempo when you otherwise might not be able to. I really think this probably needs to make the cut. So that pretty much covers the whole build, from the champion to the specific cards to some potential changes. I think there is something here under the surface, despite many people kind of poo-pooing it right off the bat. I think that there's a variety of different options in this particular realm combination, and Majus provides some typically powerful effects for card games through the card draw as well as the mana ramp. But what do you think? Were there cards that I missed? Were there other ones? Have you had any success with this particular archetype? Let me know down in the comments, and definitely hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed already for more Runestrike content. That'll do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And Black Lives Matter.